May 1940. Following the stunning success of the German blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, the main forces of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the French First Army were catastrophically cut off and encircled in a small pocket around the French port of Dunkirk. Compelling evidence. The Allied forces were trapped between the advancing Wehrmacht and the English Channel. The German mechanized divisions had reached the coast, effectively sealing the largest portion of the Allied armies. The situation was a strategic disaster for the Allies, forcing the immediate, desperate-at-command decision to evacuate the troops rather than fight a final, hopeless battle for the pocket. Insightful expert quote: "The focus shifted from victory to sheer survival. British General Lord Gort began organizing the defense of a shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk, recognizing that the primary objective was to buy time for the Royal Navy to launch an evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo. Vivid example. The roads leading into Dunkirk were choked with demoralized, exhausted troops, burning vehicles, and thousands of abandoned trucks and artillery pieces, a physical testament to the speed and efficiency of the German offensive. The rich explanation for the encirclement is the German use of shore-pumped point of main effort through the Ardennes, bypassing the fixed French defenses and confirming the tactical obsolescence of static defense against rapid mechanized warfare. The Allies faced strategic annihilation, with the entire army concentrated on a few miles of exposed beach. In one of the most controversial command decisions of the war, the German armored divisions, poised to crush the trapped Allies, were ordered to halt, granting the BEF a miraculous 72-hour reprieve. Compelling evidence. On May 24, 1940, Hitler issued the infamous Halt Order, restraining the armored division's Panzer spearheads just miles from Dunkirk, leaving the final assault to the slow-moving infantry and the Luftwaffe. This inexplicable pause provided the British with the crucial 3 days needed to organize the evacuation perimeter and begin lifting troops off the beaches, a strategic gift that directly saved the entire army. Insightful expert quote: "The reason for the Halt Order is still debated, but evidence suggests a combination of factors. German commanders' overestimation of the marshy ground's ability to support tanks, and Hermann Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could finish the destruction from the air alone. Vivid example. The stranded British troops watched in stunned disbelief as the Panzer divisions, the very forces capable of overrunning their position in hours, simply stopped and dug in, allowing exhausted soldiers to be ferried to the beaches. The rich explanation for the halt is the failure of German inter-service cooperation. Göring's insistence on an air-only final strike, combined with Hitler's desire to preserve his tanks for the final push into France, outweighed the strategic priority of total annihilation of the enemy. The German failure to deliver the final, crushing blow created the necessary window for the miracle to begin. The evacuation itself was a logistical nightmare fought under constant air attack, with the exposed beaches providing little cover against the relentless bombing and strafing. Compelling evidence. The Luftwaffe, under Göring's orders, initiated continuous heavy air attacks, turning the beaches and the waters offshore into a chaotic killing zone, targeting the troops and the naval vessels attempting the rescue. The British Royal Navy suffered heavy losses, with over 200 naval vessels sunk or severely damaged during the operation, confirming the immense danger posed by the German aerial attacks and coastal artillery. Insightful expert quote: "The rescue relied on speed and sheer volume of transport. Troops waited for hours in lines stretching into the sea, often chest-deep in frigid water, desperate to reach the small ships capable of getting them off the exposed shoreline." Vivid example. The most effective defense against the German bombers was the relentless presence of RAF fighter squadrons flying cover from airfields in England. This air support, though often unseen by the waiting troops, fought fierce engagements to keep the skies clear over the beaches. The rich explanation for the successful air defense is the proximity of the RAF bases. Fighting over their own territory allowed British fighters to maximize their operational time and sortie rates, effectively neutralizing the Luftwaffe's attempt at total air dominance over the evacuation zone. The beaches became a gauntlet of sand, water, and fire, a terrifying testament to the desperation of the escape. The miracle was ultimately secured by an unprecedented improvised effort involving hundreds of civilian vessels, the legendary Little Ships of Dunkirk. Compelling evidence. The shallow, flat beaches of Dunkirk prevented large naval destroyers and transports from approaching the shore directly. This logistical problem was solved by the spontaneous mobilization of over 700 small civilian vessels. These vessels, including fishing boats, yachts, lifeboats, and pleasure craft, were commandeered by the Navy or sailed voluntarily by their civilian owners, crossing the treacherous channel to ferry troops from the beaches to the larger waiting ships offshore. An insightful expert, quote, "The little ships proved strategically vital because their shallow drafts allowed them to maneuver directly into the beach sand and shallow water, where the larger naval vessels could not venture, making them the indispensable link in the chain of rescue." Vivid example. The sheer volume of this civilian effort, operating without military protection and under constant shell fire, embodied the national resolve. These small, vulnerable vessels faced the full fury of the German bombardment, yet continued their relentless shuttle service. The rich explanation for the civilian necessity is the German destruction of the Dunkirk harbor piers and docks. With the ports unusable, the shallow beaches became the only viable loading zone, a task only the small craft could handle effectively. The spontaneous mobilization of civilian vessels transformed a military defeat into a legendary national moment of unity and survival. The evacuation ended on June 4, 1940, achieving a success that defied all initial military predictions and provided Britain with the necessary foundation to continue the war. Compelling evidence. Against all odds, 338,226 Allied soldiers, over 20,000 British, and 118,000 French were successfully rescued. Crucially, the overwhelming majority of the British Expeditionary Force (BEF) manpower was saved, providing the experienced corps necessary to rebuild the British Army in the face of the looming threat of German invasion. Insightful expert, quote, "Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously warned that wars are not won by evacuations, but the successful rescue provided Britain with a massive psychological boost and a tangible symbol of national defiance." Vivid example. The immediate aftermath revealed the immense material cost. Nearly all of the BEF's heavy equipment, including tanks, artillery, and transport trucks, was abandoned on the beaches of Dunkirk, representing a crippling loss of materiel. The rich explanation for the strategic consequence is the preservation of human capital. While the materiel loss was severe, saving the bulk of the trained fighting men ensured Britain retained the capacity to defend itself against the anticipated German invasion, Operation Civilian. The Miracle of Dunkirk was a military defeat, but a strategic and moral triumph that guaranteed Britain would fight on alone. The crucial 72-hour halt of the German armored divisions remains the single greatest strategic enigma of the Battle of France, a failure of command integration that directly led to the Allied survival. Compelling evidence. The order to stop the Panzer spearheads came directly from the highest levels of the German command, bypassing the successful field generals who were mere miles from the trapped British Expeditionary Force, BEF. The halt created an unnatural perimeter of inaction around Dunkirk, providing the BEF with the invaluable time required to organize a defensive line and commence the evacuation plan, EIC. Insightful expert quote. Historical analysis suggests the Halt Order was driven by a complex mix of inter-service rivalry and overconfidence. Hermann Göring convinced Hitler that the destruction of the pocket should be reserved as a demonstration of the Luftwaffe's power, a critical misjudgment of aerial effectiveness against entrenched ground troops. Vivid example. Field commanders like General Guderian protested the order vehemently, recognizing the strategic opportunity being squandered. Their frustration confirmed that the final, crushing blow was thwarted not by Allied strength, but by internal German political and doctrinal failure. The rich explanation for the German error is the failure of command priority. Hitler chose to preserve his tanks for the final push into France and deferred to Göring's pride, prioritizing a symbolic victory, destruction by air over the strategic necessity of total, immediate annihilation of the Beibig. The German command failure transformed a certain military annihilation into a miraculous window of escape. While the soldiers on the beaches often felt abandoned, the successful evacuation was made possible by the relentless, often unseen commitment of the Royal Air Force, RAF, in the battle overhead. Compelling evidence. The RAF Fighter Command flew over 4,000 sorties during the 9 days of Operation Dynamo, successfully contesting German air superiority over the shrinking perimeter and the English Channel crossing. The RAF lost over 100 aircraft during the operation, a high cost that masked the larger strategic gain, neutralizing the Luftwaffe's attempts at sustained, coordinated heavy bombing of the beaches and the vessels. Insightful expert, quote, "The pilots fought at the very limit of their operational endurance, with many flying multiple sorties a day from bases only minutes away. Their proximity to the battle provided them with a crucial time, over-target advantage against the Luftwaffe, which had longer flight times. Vivid example. The relentless presence of the RAF, primarily Hurricanes and Spitfires, prevented the German Luftwaffe from achieving the absolute air dominance Göring had promised Hitler, significantly reducing the success rate of German bombing runs against the congested beaches. Explanation for the air defense's effectiveness is the strategic positioning. Fighting over home territory allowed British fighters to maximize their operational time and sortie rates, protecting the vulnerable evacuation vessels and providing a vital, if distant, shield for the troops. The RAF's air battle was the silent, necessary precondition for Operation Dynamo's success, a shield forged in constant aerial combat. The evacuation was a logistical masterpiece executed under extreme duress, defined by the failure of the port and the necessity of improvising loading zones on the open beaches. Compelling evidence. The German bombing destroyed most of the permanent docks and piers in Dunkirk harbor, crippling the port's capacity. This forced the Royal Navy and engineers to improvise, relying on 2 narrow remaining wooden piers and the open beaches themselves. The shallow, flat nature of the beaches meant that naval destroyers and larger transports could not approach the shore. This logistical choke point demanded the use of small, shallow draft vessels to ferry the men to the waiting ships, the crucial link in the chain. Insightful expert, quote, "Naval engineers performed incredible feats under continuous fire, extending the remaining East Mole pier and constructing makeshift jetties out of grounded trucks and sandbags to speed up loading." Vivid example. Over 200,000 troops were ultimately evacuated from the single East Mole pier, turning it into the most congested and vulnerable loading zone in the entire operation, subjected to constant shelling and bombing. The rich explanation for the success is the rigorous military discipline enforced by the remaining officers. Even in chaos, the exhausted troops maintained orderly queues stretching into the sea, maximizing the throughput of the limited loading zones. The logistical ingenuity and military discipline transformed a chaotic retreat into a controlled evacuation. The spontaneous mobilization of civilian vessels, the famous Little Ships of Dunkirk, was a statistically and strategically indispensable element of the rescue operation. Compelling evidence. Approximately 700 to 850 civilian manned and requisitioned vessels participated in the evacuation. These included fishing boats, river barges, yachts, and pleasure craft, most of which were designed for inland or coastal use, not open-sea warfare. These shallow-draft civilian vessels were solely responsible for the crucial task of shuttling troops from the beach sand out to the larger transports anchored over a mile offshore, a task that military vessels could not perform. Insightful expert, quote, "The contribution of the little ships was massive. They accounted for the rescue of over 100,000 men, nearly 1/3 of the total evacuated force, confirming their essential strategic role." Vivid example. The civilian captains and volunteers sailed across the heavily mined and bombed channel without military training, driven by national urgency and a profound sense of duty, underscoring the powerful moral component of the evacuation. The rich explanation for their necessity is the destruction of the docks. With the port out of action, the shallow beaches became the primary exit, a logistical problem only the civilian craft, with their shallow drafts, were capable of solving efficiently. The Civilian Armada was a powerful statistical reality of national unity, transforming military defeat into a shared act of resistance. The successful preservation of human capital came at a crippling, near-total loss of the British Expeditionary Force's heavy materiel, creating a monumental military deficit. Compelling evidence. The BEF was forced to abandon virtually all of its heavy equipment on the beaches and along the roads leading to Dunkirk. This included 700 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, 68,000 trucks, and vast quantities of fuel and ammunition. The total tonnage of equipment lost was over 20,000 vehicles, representing the entire mechanized capability of the British Army at the time, leaving Britain virtually defenseless against a potential German invasion, Operation Civilian. Insightful expert, Quote, "The material loss was so severe that it took Britain over a year to replenish the abandoned tanks and artillery, forcing the nation into a period of extreme vulnerability and dependency on its air force and home defenses. Vivid example. The troops salvaged what little they could, abandoning their heavy rifles and machine guns only when they were waist-deep in the water. The sheer scale of the equipment left behind was a gift to the advancing German Wehrmacht that fueled their subsequent operations. The rich explanation for the high loss is the prioritization of human capital. Lord Gort's command decision was clear: men over materiel. This strategic calculation, though crippling in the short term, preserved the trained corps needed to rebuild the army. The Great Abandonment confirmed that the Miracle of Dunkirk was a desperate exchange, manpower saved for machinery lost. The successful evacuation of the British forces was fundamentally reliant on the fierce, high-cost rearguard action fought by the remaining French divisions who defended the final perimeter. Compelling evidence. Approximately 1 in 18,000 French troops were evacuated alongside the British, but French units were explicitly tasked with holding the crucial, shrinking perimeter line against the final German thrusts, buying vital days for the evacuations. French commanders, following orders, committed their remaining units to high-casualty holding actions, notably the desperate defense of the Sgleal Pocket, which tied down 7 German divisions and delayed the final assault on Dunkirk. Insightful expert quote, "This rearguard action by the French First Army was a staggering military sacrifice. By holding the line, they diverted overwhelming German pressure away from the exposed beaches, confirming their role as the necessary human shield for the entire evacuation." Vivid example. The French forces fighting inside the Dunkirk perimeter were often the last off the beaches. Thousands were captured after the final withdrawal, having fought until the last possible moment to cover the BEF's escape. The rich explanation for the French commitment is the necessity of maintaining the Allied coalition and the promise of future French support. The French sacrifice was a tragic cost of the strategic escape, but it was essential to the operation's success. The French rearguard paid the highest tactical price to ensure the strategic survival of the British Army. The success of Operation Dynamo was a defining moment of geopolitics and naval power, confirming the continued, decisive strategic dominance of the Royal Navy and the English Channel. Compelling evidence. The entire operation was conducted entirely by sea, underscoring the massive strategic advantage held by Britain. The ability to project naval power across the Channel without interference from a capable enemy surface fleet. The German Navy, Kriegsmarine, was largely absent from the final assault, having suffered significant losses in the prior Norway campaign. The primary threat to the evacuation vessels remained the Luftwaffe and German coastal artillery. Insightful expert. Quote, "Dunkirk was a stark confirmation of the limitations of the German military machine. Despite having the strongest army in the world, the lack of a powerful, modern navy prevented them from truly closing the trap once the BEF reached the coast." Vivid example. The British destroyers and minesweepers, while suffering heavy losses, maintained control of the Channel's narrow sea lanes, establishing a continuous, if perilous, bridge to the English ports of Dover and Ramsgate. The rich explanation for the Channel's role is its function as a natural defensive moat. This geographic reality, combined with British naval and air control, was the final, unassailable barrier that Hitler's Wehrmacht could not cross at that time. The English Channel was the ultimate strategic factor that saved the BEF from total annihilation. Despite being a crushing military defeat, the Miracle of Dunkirk was immediately transformed into a profound psychological and moral triumph for the British nation. Compelling evidence. The successful rescue of 30,000 226 men provided Prime Minister Winston Churchill with the human capital he needed and, crucially, a unifying narrative of national defiance and shared resolve. Churchill used the event to rally the nation, replacing the political shame of military defeat with a story of unbreakable national unity, a narrative essential for preparing the country for the looming threat of invasion, Operation Civilian. Insightful expert. Quote, "The myth of the miracle was powerful. It focused the public narrative on the heroism of the little ships and the courage of the Royal Navy and RAF, completely obscuring the profound strategic failure that necessitated the evacuation in the first place." Vivid example. The shared experience, watching newsreels, hearing the accounts of the returning troops, and the civilian participation, forged a sense of collective purpose that was essential for enduring the subsequent Battle of Britain and the Blitz. The rich explanation for the moral lift is the contrast between the expected and the achieved outcome. Against all odds, the entire army was saved, turning imminent strategic disaster into an unexpected, powerful victory of national will. The psychological triumph of survival provided the necessary foundation for Britain to continue the war alone. The successful preservation of the BEF was a crucial factor in the subsequent German decision to abandon Operation Cilion, the planned invasion of Great Britain. Compelling evidence. The survival of the 338,000 trained soldiers provided Britain with the manpower necessary to quickly establish defensive positions and coastal garrisons, complicating the German invasion plans. More significantly, the tenacious defense of the RAF over the Dunkirk skies proved to the German High Command that air superiority, the non-negotiable prerequisite for a sea invasion, would be fiercely and effectively contested. Insightful expert. Quote, "The German High Command viewed the Dunkirk evacuation as a major failure, particularly Goering, whose Luftwaffe had failed to deliver the promised annihilation. This failure undermined the confidence required to launch the far riskier Operation Cilion. Vivid example. The rapid rebuilding of the British Army's defensive posture, using the salvaged troops and newly produced equipment, contributed to the German reassessment of the viability of the sea crossing against a prepared defense. The rich explanation for the abandonment of Cilion is the interconnected failure of the services. The failure of the Panzer to close the trap, combined with the failure of the Luftwaffe to secure air dominance, confirmed that a risky sea invasion was a gamble Hitler was ultimately unwilling to take. The survival of the BEF provided the necessary core strength to dissuade the German invasion. The Miracle of Dunkirk remains the definitive symbol of a successful strategic retreat, its legacy defined by the profound sacrifice of materiel for the preservation of human fighting power. Compelling evidence. The single greatest long-term cost of the operation was the staggering loss of materiel, leaving Britain acutely vulnerable in 1940 and forcing a monumental, year-long effort to replace the lost tanks, artillery, and transport capacity. The strategic benefit, however, was incalculable. The preservation of the 338,000 trained fighting men provided the essential human core for the future Allied campaigns in North Africa and the final D-Day landings. Insightful expert. Quote, Churchill summarized the dilemma. "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." Yet, the psychological victory allowed Britain to survive the crisis and continue the war. Vivid example. The beaches of Dunkirk became the largest military graveyard of British equipment in history, a desolate testament to the desperate choice made by Lord Gort, a choice that ultimately secured the survival of the nation. The rich explanation for the enduring legacy is the moral clarity of the exchange. The decision to prioritize personnel over equipment was a strategic masterstroke that saved the entire British war effort from immediate collapse. 1. The Miracle of Dunkirk was a strategic defeat and a moral victory that secured the foundation for the final Allied triumph. The operation's success relied heavily on the relentless, high-risk deployment of the Royal Navy RN destroyer fleet, which acted as the principal lifeline and suffered devastating losses. Compelling evidence. The RN deployed 40 destroyers and hundreds of smaller minesweepers, sloops, and trawlers. These destroyers were the primary means of mass transport, capable of lifting thousands of men quickly, primarily from the East Mole Pier. The destroyer fleet, operating under continuous Luftwaffe attack and heavy German coastal artillery fire, sustained massive losses. 6 destroyers were sunk, and 19 others were severely damaged, confirming the immense peril of the narrow channel crossing. Insightful expert, quote, "The loss rate was deemed acceptable because the destroyers were the only vessels that combined the necessary speed, size, and minimal armament to complete the long, quick turnarounds between Dunkirk and the English ports." Vivid example. Destroyers often loaded over 1,000 men at a time, far exceeding their design capacity, with soldiers crammed onto every available deck space. The risk was compounded by the fact that the entire operation was conducted over heavily mined waters. The rich explanation for the high risk is the strategic necessity. The destroyers provided the indispensable mass transport required to achieve the necessary throughput of over 300,000 men in just 9 days, a task impossible for smaller craft alone. The destroyer fleet sacrifice was the fundamental, costly statistical reality that ensured the majority of the BEF's rescue. The conditions on the beaches were defined by utter chaos, fear, and the necessary imposition of rigid military discipline that alone prevented a total collapse into panic. Compelling evidence. Soldiers often waited for days on the open beaches, enduring constant strafing and bombing attacks, lacking adequate food, water, or shelter. The beaches were a terrifying open arena where the German Luftwaffe could target massed formations of men with impunity, testing the limits of the soldiers' physical and psychological endurance. Insightful expert quote: "The ability of the exhausted, demoralized troops to maintain orderly queues stretching hundreds of yards into the sea was a profound act of collective discipline, preventing the mass panic that would have paralyzed the evacuation." Vivid example. Officers used whatever means necessary, from verbal exhortation to drawn sidearms, to maintain order in the queues. The men understood that discipline was the final, non-negotiable prerequisite for survival. The rich explanation for the order is the shared goal. The sight of the constant flow of little ships and naval vessels provided a visible, tangible goal, reinforcing the belief that rescue was possible if order was maintained. The discipline of desperation was a psychological shield that ensured the massive throughput of the evacuation. The successful escape was amplified by a series of critical tactical failures and poor coordination within the German ground forces attempting to close the perimeter. Compelling evidence. Beyond the initial Halt Order, German forces faced several tactical obstacles: the effective destruction of bridges and roads by the Allies, and the unexpected tenacity of the shrinking defensive perimeter. The German infantry divisions tasked with the final assault after the Panzers halted were slower and lacked the specialized armor required to rapidly break the reinforced defensive line around the port and beaches. Insightful expert quote: "The muddy, marshy ground around the Dunkirk perimeter, contrary to the initial Panzer commander's fears, was not entirely impassable, but certainly slowed the final German infantry advance, buying precious hours for the evacuation." Vivid example. The deliberate Allied flooding of the drainage ditches and low-lying ground forced the German infantry into predictable, constricted lines of advance, where they were met by determined resistance from the remaining BEF and French units. The rich explanation for the slow pursuit is the prioritization shift. The Germans shifted focus toward preparing for the final attack on France, committing only sufficient forces to contain the pocket rather than overwhelm it immediately, confirming a critical error in command priority. The slow, uncoordinated German close provided the necessary time to conclude. Operation Dynamo. The single most crucial logistical artery of the entire operation was the narrow, exposed wooden structure known as the East Mole Pier, which became the lifeline for the majority of the troops. Compelling evidence. The East Mole was a thin, railway-loading jetty extending nearly a mile into the sea. Engineers improvised by lining the sides with wood to allow destroyers to dock, a crucial modification. This single, narrow structure became the loading point for over 200,000 men, as 2/3 of the total evacuated force, confirming its indispensable logistical role. Insightful expert quote: "The Mole was a continuous logistical miracle, constantly subjected to dive bombing and shellfire. Engineers worked relentlessly to repair damage and maintain the structure, fully aware that a catastrophic breach would instantly halt the evacuation of the main body of troops." Vivid example. Troops often had to file onto the Mole for hours, exposed and under attack, before boarding. The danger was compounded by the speed required for the ships to quickly tie up and depart, often leading to confusion and loss of life at the final boarding point. The rich explanation for the reliance is the port destruction. With the main docks destroyed, the Mole was the only structure deep enough for large naval vessels to utilize, concentrating the risk and the hope of the entire operation onto a single, fragile wooden pier. The East Mole was a vulnerable, thin thread that bore the weight of the entire British Army survival. The evacuation route across the English Channel was a continuous minefield, making the efforts of the unsung minesweeper crews a critical, high-risk factor in maintaining the lifeline. Compelling evidence. The German Navy, Kriegsmarine, continuously mined the main channel routes, known as trolls, used by the evacuation vessels, posing a constant, silent threat to the hundreds of ships in transit. The minesweeper crews, operating continuously, worked to clear the narrow corridors, suffering heavy losses but ensuring that the vital routes remained open for the vulnerable transports. Insightful expert quote: "The minesweepers and trawlers were often the first to arrive and the last to leave, taking on the dangerous, methodical work of clearing the sea lanes while the destroyers and civilian ships executed the actual lifts. Vivid example. The evacuation relied on 3 primary shifting routes, with minesweepers constantly monitoring and clearing the most sheltered, shortest corridor, known as Route Z, hugging the French coast, despite the constant danger of German shore battery fire. The rich explanation for the necessity is the sheer volume of German mining. Without the continuous work of the minesweepers, the channel would have quickly become impassable, leading to massive ship losses and the termination of the Operation.TDE. The minesweeper crews performed the tedious, dangerous work that provided the necessary naval security for the little ships. The colossal volume of abandoned materiel was the largest single strategic transfer of equipment in the Western Front, immediately utilized by the German Wehrmacht to accelerate its conquest. Compelling evidence. The sheer amount of materiel left behind, including 450,000 tons of stores, 2,500 artillery pieces, and 68,000 vehicles, provided a significant, immediate windfall for the advancing German army. The captured equipment was quickly salvaged and put into service, with German forces integrating captured British trucks and artillery into their own logistics trains, aiding their final push against the remaining French forces. Insightful expert, quote, "The vast stores of captured British ammunition and fuel were immediately utilized by the Germans, enabling them to sustain their mechanized units without stressing their own rapidly extending supply lines." Vivid example. The German forces reportedly found entire trainloads of ammunition and perfectly good transport vehicles, confirming the desperate haste and logistical totality of the British abandonment. The rich explanation for the rapid exploitation is the German need to maintain momentum. The captured British equipment was a ready-made, massive supply drop that directly aided the speed and success of the subsequent Cossretic offensive against France. The abandoned arsenal became a massive, unintended gift that fueled the next phase of the German conquest. The participation of the civilian little ships was driven by a powerful moral imperative and was a spontaneous act of national unity that transcended military planning. Compelling evidence. The call for civilian vessels went out largely through media appeals and word of mouth. Volunteers arrived at ports like Ramsgate and Dover, often sailing their own small vessels directly into the war zone. The volunteers included fishermen, engineers, yacht owners, and retired naval personnel, forming a spontaneous, courageous armada operating under the direct control of the Royal Navy's smaller operations staff. Be a insightful expert, quote, "The moral weight of the rescue was immense. For the British public, the sight of the returning ships, covered in grime and carrying the exhausted soldiers, was a direct, tangible connection to the war, solidifying the national resolve." Vivid example. The small ships faced not only enemy fire and mines, but also the turbulent, unpredictable waters of the English Channel, demonstrating a commitment that transcended mere patriotism and entered the realm of myth. The rich explanation for the high volunteer rate is the psychological need for action. Facing the existential threat of German invasion, the civilian population seized the opportunity to directly contribute to the survival of the nation's fighting force. The successful evacuation of the troops came at a staggering cost to the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine Fleet, creating a massive, immediate naval deficit. Compelling evidence. In addition to the 6 sunken destroyers, the total loss of ships during Operation Dynamo included 200-plus naval and merchant vessels, minesweepers, sloops, trawlers, and transports, and significant damage to many others. The RN's immediate fleet strength was severely depleted, forcing a temporary naval strategic defensive posture in the Channel, which was desperately needed to prepare for the expected invasion, Operation Cilion. Insightful expert, quote, "The naval losses were severe enough that they temporarily forced a re-evaluation of the RN's ability to protect the island against a large-scale amphibious landing, confirming the high price paid to secure the Army's escape." Vivid example. The surviving destroyers were often so severely damaged that they required months of critical repairs, temporarily reducing Britain's overall naval strength at the precise moment it was needed to fight the Battle of Britain. The rich explanation for the high loss rate is the intense, continuous nature of the Luftwaffe attacks on the restricted channel routes. The vessels were slow-moving, concentrated targets, making them highly vulnerable to concentrated aerial bombing. The cost in ships confirmed that the evacuation was a full-scale, devastating naval operation fought at the edge of British capacity. The Germans, despite their military triumph, failed to fully exploit the strategic and propaganda value of the chaos they had created, focusing too narrowly on the military aspect of the sinking. Compelling evidence. German propaganda initially touted the evacuation as the inevitable, total annihilation of the BEF, but the actual number rescued, 338,226, severely undermined this claim, turning their victory narrative into a lie. The German High Command failed to grasp the psychological importance of the evacuation for the British public, allowing Churchill to effectively spin the military defeat into a powerful, morale-boosting narrative of resistance. Insightful expert, quote, Hitler's inexplicable Halt Order became a profound psychological blunder. By allowing the army to escape, he gave his primary enemy the human capital and the moral narrative needed to continue the war. Vivid example. The sheer scale of the equipment abandoned on the beaches, though a massive material gain, was outweighed by the moral cost of allowing the entire trained enemy army to slip away under their noses. The rich explanation for the propaganda failure is the German inability to understand the British concept of survival. They focused on materiel destruction, failing to realize the true strategic prize was the psychological defeat of the nation, which they failed to achieve. The failure of German propaganda allowed the British to seize the morale victory that was indispensable for the coming fight. The Miracle of Dunkirk was a strategic pivot point that remains the definitive symbol of human will and naval power overcoming seemingly insurmountable military defeat. Compelling evidence. The rescue of 338,226 men, achieved against overwhelming military odds and strategic paralysis, provided Britain with the essential human capital needed to rebuild its army and continue the war against Nazi Germany. The operation confirmed the decisive strategic role of naval power and air defense DWAs over the Channel, providing the necessary buffer that ultimately protected the island nation from invasion. Insightful expert, quote, Churchill's famous assessment, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender," was made credible by the events at Dunkirk. The rescue provided the people and the morale to turn the rhetoric into reality. Vivid example. The abandoned equipment was a high price, but the strategic exchange was sound. The loss of materiel was temporary, while the preservation of the trained army was a permanent asset that guaranteed Britain would stand alone. The rich explanation for the final legacy is the moral clarity of the decision to prioritize human capital. That choice, made under fire, secured the necessary foundation for the Allied victory that lay 5 years in the future. The Miracle of Dunkirk was the necessary, desperate moral and strategic triumph that secured the future of the Allied war effort. The enduring geopolitical impact of the Miracle of Dunkirk was its function as the single event that guaranteed Britain would remain in the war, permanently cementing the strategic objective of the Allied coalition. Compelling evidence. The survival of the 338,226 trained Allied soldiers provided Prime Minister Winston Churchill with the political and military justification to refuse any consideration of a peace treaty with Nazi Germany, despite the loss of all heavy equipment. This refusal was a critical geopolitical decision that ensured the Axis powers would continue to face an active, unyielding Western foe, preventing Hitler from concentrating all his forces against the Soviet Union later in the war. Insightful expert, quote, the rescue validated the concept of the British strategic withdrawal, confirming that the preservation of human capital was the ultimate priority. This commitment prevented the total political and military collapse of the Anglo-French alliance, even after France surrendered. Vivid example. The successful rescue provided the tangible proof needed to convince President Franklin D. Roosevelt that Britain was a determined fighting partner, paving the way for the critical Lend-Lease Act and securing American industrial support. The rich explanation for the geopolitical finality is that the survival of the army removed the primary military leverage Hitler had over Britain, forcing the war to continue on British terms of national resolve. Miracle of Dunkirk was the necessary precondition for the future existence of The Allied Coalition. The final analysis of Operation Dynamo confirms its lasting significance as the defining case study in the power of human will and ingenuity over material and strategic defeat. Compelling evidence. The entire operation was a logistical improvisation, driven by civilian volunteers, little ships, and the unwavering discipline of the soldiers queuing on the beaches, achieving a throughput that professional military planning alone could never have guaranteed. The operation underscored the final, critical failure of German intelligence and command, which overestimated air power, Göring, and succumbed to caution, Hitler, squandering the unprecedented opportunity for total strategic annihilation. Insightful expert. Quote, "The battle confirmed the ultimate strategic reality that the morale of the British nation, fueled by the narrative of the rescue, was the most valuable asset saved. This moral resilience was essential for enduring the subsequent Battle of Britain. Vivid example. The massive loss of equipment was deemed acceptable because the core of experienced, trained manpower was preserved, confirming the crucial strategic principle of personnel over materiel that governed the desperate choice made by Lord Gort. The rich explanation for the enduring legacy is the moral clarity of the event. The rescue affirmed a national value system that prioritized human life and liberty over possessions and equipment, a powerful ideal for which to fight a long war. The final victory was secured not by the ships saved, but by the will preserved. The Miracle of Dunkirk was a strategic paradox, a massive military defeat that served as the indispensable foundation for the eventual Allied victory in World War II. Compelling evidence. The preservation of the 338,236 men ensured that when the Allies were finally ready to launch the counter-invasions of North Africa and Normandy, the experienced core of the British Army was intact to participate. The battle confirmed the final, irreversible importance of sea superiority over the Channel, forcing the Germans to abandon Operation Civilian and guaranteeing Britain's survival as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the final European campaign. Insightful expert. Quote, "The events at Dunkirk taught the world that in total war, the ability to adapt, improvise, and maintain morale can often transcend overwhelming enemy material superiority." Vivid example. The psychological shift from defeatism to defiance, crystallized by Churchill's rhetoric, was the single greatest output of the operation, giving the British people the necessary resolve to face Hitler alone for over a year. The rich explanation for the final legacy is the moral dimension. Dunkirk provided the narrative, the men, and the proof that Britain would never yield, transforming a military disaster into the ultimate foundation for the Allied triumph. The 2000 necessary. Bloody first step on the long road to Berlin.